you all for coming as well. I've provided an excellent introduction there, but essentially I'm looking at sort of elements of philosophy and sociology and things like that to try and define how we form an understanding of a place. And over the past year or so I've been interviewing and talking to lots of different practitioners who have been involved in the development of 20th century Belfast, and I'm going to present kind of a narrative that I've strung together from this. And part of the theory suggests that there is no real such thing as a hard truth when it comes to these sorts of things. So if you disagree with me, just shout out, feel free to ask questions during the presentation. But I'll start now. Belfast is a city still defined by its Victorian age. The rapid expansion of the town over the 1800s led to it being granted city status by Queen Victoria in 1888, leading to the construction of Belfast's arguably greatest building, its City Hall, and even more arguably its most coherent urban development, Royal Avenue, which was previously the narrow thoroughfare of Hercules Street. Just to talk briefly about this, you can see the Linen Hall here, which became the site of the City Hall with Donegal Place leading up, and Donegal Place and High Street used to be the main thoroughfare in Belfast. And here you can see Hercules Street, which was just a narrow lane. But then in the late 1800s we can see how the Victorians widened Hercules Street and totally demolished it, and then built this sort of grand Victorian avenue that was leading down then to the Victorian centre of the city, the City Hall. Belfast started the 20th century on a high that unfortunately would not last too long. Alfred Bromwell Thomas, who you see here, was the architect of the City Hall, and he had a set of lofty ambitions for the city that aimed at bringing Belfast civic centre up to the Victorian expectations that had established it as a city of the empire, to use Bromwell's words. Proposed in 1925, however, they were to go unrealised for a set of reasons, both personal and international. The proposals began with a stately hotel to match the grandeur of the City Hall based on Donegal Square East, and full details of this proposal can be seen in the PRONI archives, including fascinating correspondence between Bromwell and his solicitor Charles Brett discussing the buying of the site and a list of financial backers for the scheme. Here you can see Bromwell's original drawings for the hotel. It would have been an absolutely fantastic hotel had it been built. And he produced these to try and gain financial backing for the scheme. And then this is an image that I produced, a 3D model of the hotel, what it might have looked like had it been built. Both of these buildings, incidentally, were in existence when Bromwell was proposing the hotel. This scheme coincided with another of Bromwell's proposals, this one on an urban scale. Bromwell proposed that Donegal Square would become the central space of what he called a tri-square plan. So here we see the map of Belfast in 1901. We can see the Victorian development that still exists with Donegal Place, with Royal Avenue and Donegal Place leading to Donegal Square. Bromwell proposed that Wellington Place to Chichester Street would become an imposing avenue similar to Royal Avenue, with two new grand squares standing at either end, one around Inst and the other around the Royal Courts of Justice. With this, Bromwell also proposed that the Northern Ireland Parliament building that was being touted at the time should be located in the Markets area. At this stage, of course, the housing development known as the Markets, or perhaps just the Market, did not exist. So we can assume that Bromwell was proposing to situate this on the present-day site of the Waterfront Hall, approximately there, I would think, because it finishes off his sort of urban plan quite nicely. This is a map I produced. Bromwell never actually drew this proposal as far as I can find. I've only found sort of documentation, written documentation. But you can see that the buildings in red are the buildings that exist now that I think Bromwell would have thought would have been good enough to be situated in these squares. You can see I've also located sort of the Parliament building here, and you can see the Royal Ulster Hotel here, and these blue buildings I think are buildings he would propose to be demolished with a more sort of civic-minded building built. But that's all speculation. Unfortunately, we don't actually have Bromwell's drawings of it. These proposals were never realised, and we can't but speculate as to why. I've come across some evidence again in the PRONI archives that Bromwell got on the wrong side of the Belfast Corporation. There appears to be a bit of bad blood generated over the design of the War Memorial on Donegal Square West, and Bromwell also issued the council with a writ over unpaid fees for, of all things, the design and construction of a stage for the unveiling of the City Hall's statue of Victoria. The most likely spanner in the works for Bromwell's proposals, however, are a lot less personal and scurrilous. The Wall Street crash of 1929 caused a rapid industrial decline across the UK and indeed across the world. Apart from the boost of the Second World War gave the shipyards, rope and sirocco works, Belfast industry never really recovered, and the Victorian boom years, along with any further urban pretensions, were effectively at an end. As the war was drawing to a close, the council employed W.R. Davidge, an expert in the newly developed discipline of planning, to create a set of reports for Belfast. This came from an awareness that both the old Victorian housing stock and the road system were woefully inadequate for the burgeoning city. Additionally, numerous sites across Belfast had been levelled in the Blitz, and the opportunity was seized to take control of the development of the city. The Davidge reports are also notable in that they led to the 1946 report on the Ulster countryside, which was the beginning of any legislative suggestion that something needed to be done to protect Belfast's natural amenities against the uncontrolled urban and increasing suburban development. Despite this awareness of Belfast's difficulties, nothing was really done about this until 1960, when the Stormont government employed Scottish architect Robert Matthew to put together an urban area plan for Belfast. Visionary Northern Irish civil servant John Oliver led the appointment of Matthew in the face of significant suspicion from the Unionist government, who viewed the concept of urban planning as an instrument of socialism. Slum clearance was already underway in the blighted inner city, and the idea of a new urban motorway was looking increasingly likely. Robert Matthew was brought in to make sure things were done right. Matthew set to work straight away, setting up an office in the Hollywood Road, and in the tradition of visionary Victorian planner and fellow Scot Sir Patrick Geddes, Matthew put together a regional survey for Belfast, an examination of the city and its region, and not just as an autonomous entity. This survey, Matthew proposed, should be updated frequently so as to allow planning decisions to be as relevant to the entire region as possible. It was upon this rigorous base that Matthew built his urban area plan. The Matthew plan can essentially be boiled down into 6 points. 1. A stop line was to be placed around Belfast, halting any further suburban expansion and preserving the amenities of the countryside for the citizens of Belfast. Number 2, a new town was to be built between Lurgan and Portadown, which would eventually overtake Londonderry as Northern Ireland's second city. Number 3, a series of towns were identified around Belfast which would soak up the overspill of population which could not be housed within the stop line. These towns were to be provided with new industry to provide jobs for the displaced citizens, but some were expected to commute to Belfast using the newly built network of motorways which would bring people directly into the city centre. Number 4, the creation of legally recognised green belts and the preservation of natural amenities for the use of the citizens. The final 2 points are largely administrative, but they are possibly the most vital and influential proposals. They are: a single planning authority was to be established to manage future development and maintain the regional survey. And the final one, the issue of compensation was to be taken over by the government in order to empower the new centralised planning authority. The issue of compensation is key because previous to the Matthew plan, if any planning authority wanted to deny planning permission for development, they would have to pay the applicant the difference in price between the cost of the site and the cost the site had the development taken place. So basically the planning authority only could make these decisions if they could afford to pay the applicant. So when the government took over that payment, it meant the planning authority could actually make decisions on planning grounds. The Matthew Plan's proposals were published on the 26th of February 1963, and the stop line was immediately enforced. Any planning permissions existing outside the stop line were revoked and compensation was paid to those affected. The full regional survey and plan was published on the 13th of April 1964, and the appointment of the new city design team began immediately. It was headed by another Scottish architect, the ostentatious and eccentric Geoffrey Cutcut. The speed of the implementation of the plan suggests a degree of faith Prime Minister Terence O'Neill had in Matthew's proposals. The new city design team contained many of the same professionals that worked in Cumbernauld on the outskirts of Glasgow, a project also held by Cutcut. Initial proposals for the new town suggested that the city would be a single enormous cantilevered building running from Lurgan to Portadown overlooking Lough Neagh. This was visionary and cutting-edge architecture in the tradition of the big build megalomania of modernist pioneer Le Corbusier. The project, however, was beset by problems from the start. Copcutt abruptly resigned in August 1964 after harshly criticising the new city and the Matthew Plan as a whole very publicly in the newspapers. He suggested that investment should instead go to Northern Ireland's existing second city, Londonderry, rather than contriving a new one. A further furore was incited when the new city was named Craigavon after Northern Ireland's first Prime Minister and the divisive figure of James Craig. This, along with the fact that the city's Development Commission contained no Catholic members, led to allegations of state sectarianism. The implementation of the plan was also used by unionist politicians to attack O'Neill, who was looking increasingly naive and foolish. To quote John Oliver, O'Neill would go out of his way, he'd invite us to dinner, he'd pick our brains, yet he had this weakness at the same time. He was essentially a snob and a cad who made no attempt to prepare the ground for the reforms. He'd make a big speech. We must have a new Ulster, a liberal Ulster, and so forth, without having told his colleagues. Whereas he should have gone into a smoke-filled room and sat about with them and said, if you support me in this, I'll support you in that. He never did that. When the Commons finished, he'd go straight off, leaving others thinking, where do we come into this? At the same time as the Craigavon debacle, slum clearance was going ahead across the city and provisions were being made for a new motorway. New high-rise housing, such as the Weetabix blocks in the Lower Shankill and the Divis complex in the Lower Falls, which you see here, were being constructed. The typology of high-rise was seen as a perfect solution to a seemingly unsolvable problem. That problem being that as you demolish the old Victorian slums, you needed to rehouse the community in the same area. Modern housing standards require accommodation to be much larger than the previous ones, so how can you fit all the houses in? You build up. In 1967, Building Design Partnership produced another urban area plan, relying on Matthew's regional plan, but concentrating more in the city itself. Along with this, the plans for the urban motorway were officially published. This documentary from 1972, I'm going to show a short clip, explains the motorway plans using BDP's amazing but sadly lost model of Belfast.
Well, believe it or not, this is Belfast of the future, Belfast after the revolution. Just to get the bearings, here's the City Hall, Donegal Place, running into Royal Avenue. The dark buildings are existing buildings. The white buildings are redevelopment buildings. The intermediate coloured buildings are those to be preserved, buildings of historical architectural interest, such as the City Hall. But perhaps the most striking feature of the model is the new urban motorway circumventing the city. If we start up in the north at Whistler Street, the urban motorway there meets the present M2. The motorway then runs on stilts, round to the dock, over the Lagan on a new low-level bridge that's just north of the present cross-channel terminus, then round the east side of the Lagan, down under a new road which connects Ravenhill Road and Ormo Avenue, and down past Donegal Park, and then round here to Donegal Road, where the M1 comes in. But that's all proposed, that's just in the planning stage. But what has definitely been decided is the west leg, which starts somewhere off the model here at Donegal Road. Then runs round here, on stilts, all the section is definitely elevated, over Grosvenor Road, along here, past Divis Flat, there's Divis Tower here, over the present site of Hastings Street Police Station, that's Divis Street, up here, over the Shankill Road, past Upper Library Street area here, then it curves round with a new lodge area to the left, and bends again past Gallagher's and connects with the M2. So there we have the link between the M1 and the M2, the west leg of the motorway.
The BDP plan was all but lost at the onset of the Troubles in 1969, although the genesis of the Lancashire development can be seen within it. You see this sort of tent structure here is a concert hall, and roughly the site where the waterfront hall is. The waterfront hall is maybe more around here, but there's elements that came to exist. And then of course the west leg, see we now know it as the west link exists, although it's no longer in stilts, it's been sunk down. The heady and experimental days of the 60s were well and truly ended in 1969. I suppose both the housing problem The alleged sectarianism of the government, as exposed by the implementation of Craigavon, coupled with the supposed ignoring of the west of the province, added fuel to the civil rights movement. The burning of Bombay Street in 1969 is seen as the true beginning of the contemporary troubles. And in the same month, a 9-year-old boy, Patrick Rooney, was accidentally shot dead in his flat in the Davis complex by the RUC. The flats were falling into considerable disrepair, with complaints of antisocial behaviour, dangerous play areas for children, rat infestations and severe damp. The following clip, I'm going to show another short clip, was taken from a BBC documentary about Davis made several years ago, with the architect commenting on the damp problem in particular.
Families of that size can breathe out gallons and gallons of water overnight. All that water becomes condensation. Concrete, unfortunately, doesn't absorb any condensation, so they were aware of water running down the walls.
The flats were fitted with the then new concept, central heating, which would have helped combat the damp. But people didn't trust this, fearing it might prove too expensive.
If they had used an adequate amount of heat, they would not have created condensation. But you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. It was very difficult. In retrospect, I realise people weren't sophisticated enough in their thinking to use the flats as they were designed to be used. Simple as that.
I don't know what anyone else thinks about that, but people often call architects arrogant, and I think with that clip you clearly, I think that's why. The idea of a designer blaming his client for the faults of a design, but that's one of the big criticisms, I think, of modernism. As the Troubles took hold, Davis was to become a running battleground between the paramilitaries and the police and army. It was described by a housing activist during the 1980s as being seemingly perfectly designed for urban warfare. The solution to one housing crisis led to a deeper and far more profound housing crisis. There was a considerable amount of resistance from the community, with numerous pressure groups, including the Save the Shankill campaign, which campaigned against the wholesale demolition of the area, but was unfortunately started far too late. The destruction of the Shankill was excellently documented in Ron Wiener's The Rape and Plunder of the Shankill, which harshly criticised the Belfast Corporation's policy of demolishing entire streets, moving the population to satellite housing estates and the Matthew Growth towns, and then rebuilding over a number of years, suggesting that this irretrievably decimates the social fabric of an area. Other pressure groups included the Belfast Urban Study Group, or BUS, which produced a series of publications examining the social impact of the motorway and housing policy. And then there was the Davis Demolition Committee, who would occupy flats in the complex and render them uninhabitable. If the housing executive wasn't going to demolish them, then the committee would. And that's Sean Stitt. He was a very vocal member of the Davis Demolition Committee at the time. While the housing crisis can be said to have inspired both the urban plans of the early 1960s and the violence at the end of the decade, all three of these helped to inspire two unexpectedly connected and by and large wholly positive movements within Northern Ireland. These are the establishment of the Ulster Architectural Heritage Society and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, both owing a significant debt to the work and passion of Sir Charles Brett, grandson of the Charles Brett mentioned at the beginning as Bromwell Thomas's solicitor. Brett himself was a solicitor who joined the committee of the Northern Ireland branch of the National Trust in 1956. Upon joining, he famously asked what books to read on Belfast built heritage. When he was told there wasn't any, he set about writing his own. The lauded and still extremely important Buildings of Belfast was published in 1967. At the same time, Brett was a member of the now defunct Northern Ireland Labour Party, where he penned a policy report called Rents and Houses, in which he suggested the formation of a housing system devoid of nepotism and sectarianism and based entirely on a points system, which would rate the need for each individual who applied for housing and a replacement for the beleaguered housing trust. Brett left the Labour Party at the onset of the Troubles, feeling like he had failed in his political career. But thanks to him, the Heritage Society was established in '67 and the Housing Executive in '71. Both of these organisations can be seen to have been directly tackling the well-intentioned, if rather insensitive planning decisions of the early '60s, which proved somewhat disastrous given the uneasy political state of the province. On the establishment of the housing executive, Brett was a strong opponent of high-rise housing. He was unfortunately too late to stop Divis, New Lodge and the Weetabix blocks on Shankill Road. The executive had inherited a significant set of problems from developments like this, and while the Weetabix blocks were promptly torn down and replaced with more traditional and sensitive housing typologies, the enormous population of Divis flats was much more difficult to solve.
If the flats were demolished today, there would be nearly 1,000 families needing permits in the morning. Where on earth are they to go? There are already over 2,000 families on the waiting lists for West Belfast.
So Brett was unwilling, unlike his predecessors, to tear down the flats and disperse the community, as had happened in Sailortown and the Lower Shankill. This all in the face of extreme pressure from the community to demolish the complex. Instead, the housing executive instigated the slow demolition of the flats and the gradual rebuilding of new housing, a project which would take over 10 years to complete. Brett's keen interest in heritage and his deep concern for quality public housing reached its zenith in the Markets Housing Project, still a thriving community today. Charles Brett oversaw the building of these houses in the early 1980s, and they are still by and large in excellent condition. The real interest for myself, at least, lies on the north side of the Ormer Road. As the demolition of the Victorian terraces swept across the area, Brett managed to stop it when it came to Hamilton Street and Joy Street. Brett considered the Georgian terraces of the area as unique typologies worthy of preservation, but more than this, he saw the opportunity to convert them into modern public housing. This project was overseen by Hearth, the Historic, Environmental and Architectural Rehabilitation Trust, established by Brett as a revolving fund in 1972 and converted into a housing association in 1978 to specialise in exactly this sort of project, heritage buildings at risk, which could be converted into quality public housing. A popular thing for the critics of planning during the 70s, 80s and 90s is to suggest that decisions were made for a military agenda. There is a suggestion that since the motorway plans were devised to deal with the exploding population, and that explosion was abruptly reversed by the Troubles, the only reason it went ahead was to disrupt and displace the communities of inner West Belfast. The fact is that slum clearance in these areas commenced a decade before the Troubles began, and the motorway plans can date themselves back to the 1940s. The need for a motorway in Belfast had been identified and was going ahead regardless. There is also a suggestion that housing estates with their cul-de-sacs and blind alleys were implemented for military control. In actuality, the high-rises were based on a set of ideas developed in early modernism, the ideas of streets in the sky, ideological and utopian thinking. Similarly, the ideas relating to cul-de-sacs and what they call shared surface paving came from a Dutch idea called the Woonerf. It forces drivers to slow down in theory, as everybody, cyclists, pedestrians and motorists, have equal priority. A cul-de-sac, in theory, presents through traffic, making it safer for children playing in the street. It was incredibly unfortunate that these urban and architectural experiments coincided with the civil disturbances in Northern Ireland. And while there were some planning decisions made with security and control in mind, no doubt, it can also be said that these designs helped to serve many agendas, military, paramilitary and community. Regardless of the reasons for these decisions, we are still dealing with the artifact today. When we compare the 1901 map with the contemporary map, we can see the damage done by the West End. I'll just do that again. You can see the old grain of the Victorian streets just totally disappearing, and then you have all these sort of cul-de-sacs and houses that back onto the motorway. But perhaps less obviously, we can see the damage done by the combination of slum clearance and the Troubles. So this is a contemporary map showing this is the Falls Road, this is Shankill Road, and that's the West Link. And when you compare it with the map in 1901, it's virtually unrecognisable. So that's the Falls, that's the Shankill, and the West Link lies somewhere around here. And again, you can see the old Victorian terraces, particularly around here, totally disappear. These issues are being addressed by groups like the Forum for Alternative Belfast, a contemporary urban pressure group, which can trace its roots back to the pressure groups of the 1970s. These problems, however, are extremely difficult to solve, and looking back at the history of urban development in the city, hopefully you can appreciate how deeply connected the physical fabric of the city is to the unique problems inherent to this corner of the UK and Ireland. We need to bear in mind the mistakes of our urban forebears whilst being careful not to judge them too harshly. The problems they were attempting to solve were incredibly complex and were rendered nigh on insurmountable when the political situation collapsed. Hindsight is 2020, and we would be foolish and naive to suggest that we could have done any better given the context.